There are mirage words all over the world. You've heard of them. It's when something is called by one word but in reality it is the opposite. The mirage words can be found in Orwell. War is peace, freedom is slavery. We encounter these mirages all the time in real life as well. After all, these mirages could be whole countries. Democratic Republic of the Congo, People's Republic of China, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Me, myself, and other 144 million people live in such a mirage as well. It's the Russian Federation. Now, many people, even those who live in Russia, do not know how the structure of modern Russia was created, how the regions, republics and krais came into being, where they came from in the first place and how their relationship with the center changed. To understand how we came to this, we have to go back in time, about 30 years back. Our history begins with the collapse of the USSR. It was a difficult time for the Soviets. The current system was beginning to burst at the seams. The members of the Soviets, one by one, declared independence. The phenomenon was called the Sovereignty Parade. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and even Russia left the Soviets and said, "That's it, we're on our own." We will not delve into the intricacies and details of this period. There are some other, more important things. Some left the Union and we never saw them again, and some became part of Russia. Now it's time to ask interesting questions. Look, there is the Republic of Tatarstan. It is part of the Russian Federation. It is the Republic. They even have the president and not the governor. Though in the public mind of Russian citizens, it is the same as some Samara region. But there is the Republic of Belarus, and this one now is a separate state. I personally grew up my whole life without even thinking about why we have republics, autonomous districts and regions within the country, how they differ. After all, everyone seems to be kind of equal. Somewhere there is an additional national language and the names republics, districts, regions, well, they're called a bit differently and the hell with it. But it wasn't always like that. Look. After the collapse of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991, the Russian Federation emerged and said to other republics, "Let's celebrate the new year, and then we will come to some agreement on how we will live further on." Tatarstan, Dagestan, Bashkortostan, and other current constitutional entities of Russia might not have gone for the agreements, and in this case the composition of the Federation would have been different. And perhaps there would not have been a federation itself. But this outcome was prevented by signing the Treaty of Federation. 3 months later, in March 1992, all the regions of Russia known today signed a treaty on living together under the same roof. What did Russia, yesterday's Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, actually negotiate with? I don't even know if it's correct to say with other territories. Let's just say with others. One of the main questions was, who owns the land? Well, in a manner like this is our land and we are milking it. But who is this behind the our? Subsoil, forests, rivers, whose is it? The regions or the federal centers? Of course, the ethnic republics did not want to give up their territories. This is understandably a much more acute issue for them than for some Pskov Oblast. It was also not so long ago in the early 90s when there were parades of sovereignty and such. Those same republics took a course towards independence, towards their own responsibility for their own land.
Народом Башкирии мы говорим Верховному Совету, правительству Башкирии, вы возьмите ту долю власти, которую сами можете проглотить.
2 years later, in 1992, the federal head came again and said, "Well, your lands belong to us now." And these republics and autonomous districts have already adopted declarations that stated that the rights to the natural wealth belong to them and not to the federal center. For example, the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Bashkortostan states that the land, subsoil, natural wealth, other resources on the territory of the Bashkir Soviet Socialist Republic, as well as all its economic, scientific and technical potential, are the exclusive property of its multinational people. Most importantly, regional laws should have supremacy over federal laws, except for those items and issues which they themselves voluntarily delegated to the federal center. Nowadays it seems that the cops can come for your head for saying such words. Thank goodness we are only discussing history. It's still not considered extremism after all. Or is it? Oh yes, it certainly is. Can it even surprise anyone that even for saying no to war, you can get up to 15 years behind bars? In general, all the ethnic republics had similar declarations, and then suddenly the republics were asked to sign the Treaty of Federation, in which it was planned to equalize the rights of the ethnic republics with the usual regions. In the end, the treaty with the republics was signed, but in a compromised form. The republics retained the word republic in their name and were given more powers than a krai or a region. For example, Bashkortostan did insist that they would manage their natural resources themselves and that they would determine the tax system themselves. You remember from our previous videos how important the rules of the tax game are for the regions. By the way, Chechnya, Ingushetia and Tatarstan did not sign an agreement with the center at all at that time because it did not suit them. Tatarstan almost became a sovereign state. They even introduced their own currency there. Of course, all this seems crazy now. Well, whoever was wondering, it was on the 31st of March 1992 that the republics, territories and regions we all know as of now appeared, and Russia became an asymmetric federation. Well, a federation because the subjects were united, but asymmetric because not all of them are equal. The republics have more rights. They reached an agreement on more independent terms. Bashkortostan in general has become like a Canadian province, managing its own natural resources. But this did not last long. Just a year later, Russia adopts a new constitution from 1993 which strengthens the role of the center. The new document spelled out in detail the relationship between the center and the regions and said that the federal laws and the Russian constitution were paramount. And every law that the regions come up with cannot contradict and must be in accordance with the constitution. Thus, the constitution has in fact abolished the whole thing with agreements between the regions and the center. Now there is no need to negotiate. Now it is necessary to do everything in accordance with the main law, and the regions can only create normative acts specifying the implementation of federal laws. This action essentially unilaterally leveled the republics and autonomous districts with the regions and the krais. Consequently, legally, the rights to natural resource wealth have returned to the center. A possible Canadian-style federative scenario where 77% of the forests are owned by the regions is now a thing of the past. In the end, at this point, the federation became symmetrical because all the regions were given the same rights, which are not entirely clear. But this was only the foundation for future changes. It is clear that on the 12th of December 1993, Russia did not take a sharp turn and become centralized. It was only the beginning. And it is one thing what the laws say, and completely another how it is implemented. The direction became clear though. Russia went from a treaty federation to a constitutional federation. A legal conflict arose in the country. On the one hand, the republics have developed declarations of sovereignty and some have adopted constitutions of their own. On the other hand, the federal center has adopted a constitution stating that all who are part of the Russian Federation are fully subject to the main law of the Russian Federation. So, in order to be able to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, the republics started to draw up another bilateral agreement with the center, this time on VAT. As you remember, VAT is one of the most powerful taxes around the country because everyone pays it, and everywhere, even the child whose parents gave them money for a chocolate bar. And you know from this video that now 100% of this tax from all regions and all cities goes to the federal center, but this was not always the case. From 1994 to 1998, the regions were left with 25% of the VAT collected. Moreover, depending on the power of persuasion and political weight, the republics negotiated their own special conditions. Each year, they concluded bilateral agreements with the center, stipulating how much they would pay to the center each time. For example, Bashkortostan negotiated half of it, half of the VAT to the center, half to themselves. Here, for example, is how it was laid down explicitly in the law of the Republic. There was yet another surprise. At the time, there was complete chaos in legislation. The system was just being built, the directions were vague. You know, this is how it is in software development. Alpha, beta versions, bugs, fixes. It was the same in our country. Here is another example of a legal conflict. According to the Constitution of 1993, the traffic of goods between regions should be free. But in spite of this, 10 days later, President Boris Yeltsin issues a decree saying that, well, regions, you can impose your own taxes if you want. As a result, the regions started to impose customs duties on imports from other regions, so Mordovia could impose a 5% sales tax on excisable goods. Yes, the goods imported from a neighboring region were considered as if they were coming from abroad. As a result, about 200 different regional and local taxes were introduced by the subjects of the Federation. Yes, it was unconstitutional, but I don't think that sounds surprising now. So they ended up living like this for 3 years, and then Boris Yeltsin revoked this clause in the decree in 1996. A little later, the share of VAT for the regions dropped from 25% to 15%, and then to 0 in 2001. Since then, VAT has gone entirely from the regions to the federal center. It was around this time when such things as the budget and tax codes were invented, which simply abolished all past treaty traditions. Now all the federal subjects did as the center decided. In the end, you remember what this led to: total dependence of the city on the region and of the regions on the center. As a result, not so long ago, in 2016, a chairwoman of the Federation Senate made a statement about the emerging situation.
We believe that the concept of interbudgetary financial relations needs to be changed. Today, 35% of all revenues remain in the region and 65% go to the federal budget. This is not right. Regional leaders are losing motivation for development.
But here we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back in time. Our calendars show the year 2000, and the regions still have the leverage to make decisions in the center. The year 2000 is a key milestone in the history of modern Russia that defined the trajectory of its development. It was a defining event. Vladimir Putin came to power. After the election, key reforms were launched, increasingly locking control into the center. First, they launched the process of bringing the constitutions of the republics in line with the Russian Constitution of 1993.
We had entire republics, and it seems we still do, which have such regulations on paper as the supremacy of regional laws over federal ones. But not a single krai, not a single region does in reality have this. Therefore, the fact that the president has spoken out and, most importantly, started taking action to streamline legislation across the country, equal means equal, this, in my opinion, is normal.
In the end, all the republics renounced their sovereignty. The parliament of very independent Bashkortostan, for example, amended the constitution several times over the course of a year and a half. This process was completed only by 2002. Secondly, there is this entity in the parliament called Federation Senate. Funny thing is, nobody really knows what it's for, what it actually does. I mean, if you were to ask a regular Russian fella on the street about the Senate, the dialogue would play like this.
What the fuck is this?
I don't know.
I mean, Russians know that the Senate is the upper house of parliament, a proxy between the lower house of parliament and the president. They're kind of double checkers of bills that are passed in the State Duma and sent for the president's signature. But in our Russian reality, they always approve a bill passed in the Duma. You know, we don't really like discussions in parliament at all.
It seems to me that the State Duma is not a place for political battles, for defending political slogans and ideologies. It is a place where constructive, effective legislative activity should take place. You and I have the opportunity to discuss issues during parliamentary hearings. Of course, there will be communication between the faction leaders.
But such a situation when Senate members passed all the bills that were required from the top was not always the case. Well, before 2001, the Federation Senate was essentially a chamber of the region's chiefs. It consisted of regional governors and speakers of legislative assemblies themselves. If you became governor or speaker of the legislative assembly, you automatically represented the region in the center. These were the first people from the region, political heavyweights, resource owners who could not be ignored. And things operated somewhat like this. The State Duma approved the bill, sent it to the Federation Senate, at which point the first guys from the region came to look at it, and if they weren't happy with the bill, it was simply hammered. It never made it to the president, never made it into law, and the guys from the regions went back to their home parish. In other words, regions really could resist decisions of the center if they felt it was not in the region's interests. Pushing such heavyweights was problematic to say the least. And this explains why the only big political player who had any voice in favor of the regions is Valentina Matvienko, the chairwoman of the Federation Senate. In our last video, she spoke in favor of relocating the headquarters from Moscow to regions. She also spoke about the unequal distribution of income between the regions and the center, but all this does not move any further than a simple talk. How did this come about? On the 5th of August 2000, an important reform takes place. A law is being signed under which it will not be the regional leaders themselves who will sit in the Federation Senate, but their representatives, and they will sit on a permanent basis. It is important to note here that this was approved by the senators themselves, the governors of that time, that is, and the reform in itself does not speak of authoritarianism or democracy. But this eventually led to the fact that the representatives of the regions no longer had the same weight. They were not as independent of the center in decision-making. They even lived in Moscow 24/7. They were closer to the center than to their region. By the way, a certain Duma member Sergei Ivanov said, "Let's bring the governors back to the Federation Senate so they can revive the work of the upper chamber." This idea has been rejected because the time is different now. Governors should always be in their seats and not waste their time. There was an article about how both senators and deputies reacted to it. We will show only the ending.
At that time, the Federal Centre was faced with the task of building a power vertical and weakening the influence of regional barons at the federal level. The governors were equally removed from the upper house of Parliament under the formal excuse of inadmissibility of mixing executive and legislative activities. The Federation Senate is more of a burden. In fact, since 2000, it has been in a frozen state. It's been more of a source of status for its members than as a fully fledged body of power. The draft on the return of governors to the Senate has no chance of becoming a law without political will, and there is none to be seen.
Oh, we somehow got to the present. Let's get back in time. A number of other crucial events took place then. A couple of months before the law on the sidelining of governors was signed, they issued a presidential decree. Unlike the law, a decree is a one-way thing. That's why it's a presidential decree. So this decree created a new type of entity in the country, the Federal District. Central, Northwest, Volga, Federal Districts, and others. What the hell is this thing and what is it for? Now, it turns out the president came up with this just 3 months after he was elected. On the 13th of May 2000, the country was divided into large districts, and since there are districts, there also have to be watchmen, and these watchmen were given a simple name: Presidential Envoy to the Federal District. The most important point is that this new post stands above governors of regions as well as the presidents of republics. As you understand, such a state of affairs has further distanced regional governors from the center. After all, another proxy appeared between them and the president, as if overseeing them. But the last problem still remains. These governors are elected by the population, and the population can elect an inconvenient candidate. And here we come to the climax of events. The final shot at autonomy and influence of the regions was fired by another presidential decree of the 27th of December 2004, numbered 1603. One would wonder how else can they squeeze power of the officials in the regions. Absolutely all legislation is subordinated to the federal center. Governors no longer have direct influence on the center's decisions. A special position has been created over them which is above them all. But now the question is about election management. Until 2005, without sarcasm, we can say that elections were held according to democratic principles. Anyone who could run a decent election campaign could become governor.
To take away people's right to vote in their own region seems to be a mistake. This is a mistake because, first of all, we will be showing an element of disrespect to the voters. We will be deciding for them who should lead them. This would reduce the responsibility of local leaders for the results of their work.
But thanks to Decree 1603, they've created the lists of the very heads of regions to vote for during elections, which are approved by the president. This is how it works now. The same supervisor of the federal district, the presidential envoy, selects at least 2 candidates from each of their subordinate regions, hands them over to the head of the presidential administration. The head of the administration does his thing, quote, conducts the necessary consultations, and then passes these lists on to the president. And if the president approves the lists of potential governors, the citizens of Russia can begin voting. But if the president does not like the candidates, then no voting will take place, and the whole procedure of selecting the right candidates will be restarted once again. If you add on top of that the elimination of mayoral elections, you can clearly see the construct that bears the name of power vertical. And if one knows it and clearly understands it, the slogan, "The Tsar is good, the boyars are bad," becomes meaningless.
Russia is, on paper, a federal republic. It has a federation. It has constituent entities that delegate powers to the top, and so on. In reality, it is a unitary state, where all the constituent subjects are destroyed. They are all subordinated to Moscow both financially and in terms of power, and the governor is a heavily dependent person, not to mention subjects' legislative assemblies. They are dependent on the financial level, and all the law enforcers are marshalled there, so to speak, and if a governor takes a single step to the left or to the right, that's it. He's the next Nikita Belykh.
Mentioned in this clip, Nikita Belykh was a governor of Kirov region, up to the point when he was arrested and then sentenced to 8 years in prison for allegedly receiving a bribe of €400,000. Though Belykh was never against Putin, all he did was actually doing his job of developing the region, and quite successfully, I must say. Yet Putin took it as a personal threat. You might also remember the similar case from one of our previous videos with Sergei Fergal, who genuinely wanted to do a proper job of flourishing his region, speaking out the real problems and issues, but he was also arrested for alleged assassination attempts. I hope you get the idea of how power vertical works if someone from the system does not fully go in line with the agenda from the top. In fact, modern political scientists can argue about how full of substance this word federation is all day long, how unitary we are, and whether this power vertical structure exists at all. Maybe it is a myth. But if you delve into the material of these last 3 videos, it becomes clear that it is not just about politics, but also about the economic structure of the country. And the symbol of our times is the so-called annual direct line to the president, a phenomenon only possible in Russia. It is a special flash mob where all those gathered, including the organizers, think it is perfectly normal to ask the president about burst pipes in an apartment building in some city and request for help about the issue. With this video, we end a sub-series of 3 videos on the public administration system of Russia. We talked about the regions, the capital, and now about the evolution of the governance system. What is the right word to call it as a whole? Perhaps I wouldn't be able to put it in one word. In my mind so far, the tags are centralization, dependency, and decoration. Over the past 20 years, everything has been done to weaken the independence of the regions, both politically and economically, and to concentrate all resources in the center.
The number of federal executive offices in the regions grew from 467,000 in 2001 to 577,000 in 2003 and 786,000 in 2006. This is significantly higher than the number of officials of regional executive bodies.
This is an excerpt from a research paper called Intergovernmental Relations in Russia, prepared by socio-economic research facility the Leontiev Center. This paper tells very clearly how centralization took place in terms of taxes and exactly how the cities became dependent on the region and the region on the center. The other paper is a colossal work that laid the foundation of this video. The paper is called Why Russia Has Again Been Sliding from Federalism to Unitarianism. The author is Ildar Zulkarnay from Bashkir University. It was this work that prompted the creation of a series of 3 videos. Based on these 2 works, you can easily understand and explain the system Russians live in, and it's awesome. If only we could run it in all the schools all around the country. A lot of people here try to avoid politics as if it is something dirty and only accessible to a select few, but it is not. Any thinking person should be at least a little interested in the environment in which they live, and these videos are just an attempt to make sense of the current order of things. Besides, that scary and radical image of politics just doesn't exist, even judging from this cycle of videos. Is interbudgetary relations a politics? Is knowing where your tax goes a politics? Monetary relations with the state? Maybe that's politics. But all these are defined by laws, and laws are definitely politics, aren't they? All this story about unequal distribution of financial resources between Moscow and the regions, about the loss of authority of regional chiefs in the federal center, about the continuing centralization of power, it's no longer a project on paper that is only emerging in reality. It's a firmly settled system in Russia's modern life that's been growing like a tumor for the past 2 decades. And like a tumor with metastasis, it began spreading further to the other country. If you wondered why Putin decided to invade Ukraine, here is a simple answer. Power Vertical has been built for 22 years. For 22 years, governors have been replaced with brainless pawns whose main role is to carry out the agenda from the top. For 22 years, the resources have been concentrated in the center to be able to fund whatever crazy endeavors they need in order to maintain the power and spread their influence. Speaking of which, Russia has always had a great deal of influence over Ukraine ever since the collapse of the Soviets. The president there had to be just another governor for Putin, while Ukraine itself was to become yet another region in the Russian Federation, just a bigger one. But in 2014, the tide turned, and Putin had to use force to keep up with his plan and ambitions. But that's a story for another video. Now, thank you all for watching, and we also say special thanks to our supporters from Patreon. You know who to share this video with, and I'm the Researcher.